All right, this is Truth Be Told. I'm Tony Sweet. We got Captain Ron on a undisclosed location. How you doing, Captain Ron?
I'm doing great.
Well, guess what? We have a great show, and I think you're going to enjoy it as much as I do, because Frank has been on the show a couple times, and it's been a while. But he has a brand new book out, and it's called Military Encounters with Extraterrestrials: The Real War of the Worlds. And but there's so much to talk about. And Frank was the chief editor of the Ancient American and Times, or I think you can go to the website, ancientamerican.com, so you can check that out. But we'll find out what he's doing now, besides writing tons of books. Frank, you there?
Yes, sir, I'm here.
There you go. We got the applause going on. And Frank has had several other books, including Before Atlantis, Advanced Civilizations of Prehistoric America, The Lost Civilizations of Lemuria, and then The Lost Treasures of King Juba. I love that. So, Frank, welcome back, and we're going to get right into the interview with about your new book, Military Encounters with Extraterrestrials. I think we've all, in this industry, and even the people that just like to listen to us, know that, extraterrestrials have been around since the beginning of time. But when it comes to the actual military encounters, it's not just current military of the 21st century. This goes back quite a many years. And first of all, I want to see, what was the earliest encounters that you have seen or did your research on when it comes to extraterrestrials in the military?
Well, it began for me about 25 years ago. I was in Cairo, Egypt, and I was doing some research for a number of books that have subsequently been published about Egyptian history and prehistory. And during the course of looking over a number of documents related to that subject, I was really surprised by a multilingual translation, luckily it was in English as well, of something called the Thule Papyrus, which I'd never heard of before. And it was a legitimate document because the Cairo Museum is very careful on the types of documentation that they admit to their source library. And the Thule Papyrus tells an incredible story. It is not a mythic account. It is a real historical account, and it relates to a sighting that was made during the time of a very powerful pharaoh. His name was Thutmose III, and he reigned about 1,479 years before Christ. In other words, this Thule Papyrus goes back to well over 3,000 years ago. And this papyrus, which is just a straight military report, and this is what got me really interested in the whole subject that went into this book, it's a military report, so it's not supposed to be something that's fantasy or something you tell the kids at nighttime. It was in the royal archives, as a matter of fact, of Pharaoh Thutmose III. And this report tells about a time that happened in that year, 1479 BC, in which literally a fleet of what is described in the Thule Papyrus itself as flaming discs, fiery discs. Now that term has been translated and retranslated by Egyptologists for the past 70 years almost, when the Thule Papyrus came to be public. And it always comes out the same, either fiery discs, fiery rings, fiery shields, flaming discs. It's mostly translated as flaming discs. There were a fleet of these that appeared suddenly without any explanation over the Nile Valley. And it was this fleet of low-flying, slow-flying, fiery discs was witnessed by literally thousands of people. It was a mass sighting. And Pharaoh himself saw them. He called out the military. What could the military possibly do then as anything as today as well, just as ineffectual, but nonetheless he was obliged to do something. And we don't know it's not said in the papyrus how long this sighting took place, but it looks like it lasted for quite some time because the word had to go to Pharaoh. He didn't know about it until he went out and saw them as well. And there was no interaction between these inexplicable phenomena and the people on the ground. And eventually these things just flew off at a great speed. And that's all there is to it. That's the entire story. I was really intrigued by this story. I did this report, rather, the Thule Papyrus, and I did some further research after I got home. And I traced the origins, which I'm not going to go into. This would take a lot of time here, but I can tell you that readers of the book will be able to see that the origins that I traced for the Thule Papyrus are totally authentic, that it was always in the hands of accredited archaeologists and Egyptologists. No one even today says that the Thule Papyrus is a fake or a fraud or made up in recent times. It's authentic. It's the real thing. And the translation is authentic as well. So what are we to make of this? What are we to make of this? I mean, this is one of the finest pieces of documentation about a mass sighting of this kind anywhere, and it is a military report. And that really got me started in this. Well, what other military reports are there out there? And military reports are different than a sighting of, say, some farmer in a field or some guy, coming out of a night at the tavern and seeing something. Because military reports then, as now, have always been the same. If you are working for the armed forces in the United States or any place, you are obliged to tell the truth about any reports you give. And if you do not report the truth, if you knowingly distort the information, in the United States, you're going to go to Leavenworth. That's a federal crime. So if you're making a military report about seeing a fiery disc or what we call flying saucers or whatever, it better be the truth. And if it's found out at any time that you haven't told this, you're going to be in big trouble. And that is why the vast majority of these military sightings that have been made by people over time have not been reported, because it's really dangerous to your career if someone says this fantastic story is unbelievable, and they can make life very rough for you. But luckily, there have been a relatively few number, but still a substantial number, of armed forces personnel in the United States and elsewhere around the world that have filed terrific reports about these encounters. That make it, first of all, it makes it the finest documentation on this phenomena I have ever encountered. I did not set out with this in mind, but as I was accumulating these military reports from all over the world, mostly in the United States, but even from behind the Soviet Union, the impression made is that this is an unquestionable real phenomena. This is really taking place. These are not sensational reports in the newspapers. These are things that are on file with the armed forces of numerous countries around the world and throughout history. And that's what really impressed me. That's what encouraged me to go ahead and do this book, which is really out of character for me. I've never written anything like this. I don't claim to be a ufologist or an expert in this field at all. I approached this phenomena entirely the same as I've approached everything else that I've written about, and that is from a historical point of view. What do the historical documents have to tell us? Right. And they have to tell us that this is an absolutely real phenomenon. If I had any doubts about the validity of UFOs in the past, after completing this book, I am as certain that it exists as anything else in life. And it's really quite a powerful story that evolved. I didn't write the story. I just accumulated the material and tried to give it some cohesion and form so that average persons like myself can appreciate it. And it's a powerful epic. The most powerful thing that I've really come across, I must admit.
Ron?
Hey, Frank, you say that you believe that it's credible. What do you believe that it is?
I don't know. I do not know. I do know that it exists. I don't know where these things come from, whether they come from another time dimension or another world. I have no idea. All I do know is, and I'm absolutely sure, is that there is a highly advanced civilization beyond our planet which chooses to interface with us from time to time, and that, especially since World War I began, a little more than 100 years ago, that relationship between these high intelligences that from elsewhere and ourselves on Earth. That relationship changed fundamentally and dynamically with World War I. It changed from a benign observation onto where we have now an accelerating interface of violence and destruction and loss of lives on both sides.
Right.
It's what I describe in the book as the silent war, and it really is. We have been actually at war off and on, not continuously, although there have been some long stretches where we've been involved in actual firefights with these things, and we have killed them and shot down some of their machines, and they have done the same to us. And it goes on right now. The book really just doesn't even end. It stops because this conflict is continuous. It still goes on. And this conflict began in 1917. That's when it really started. 1916, excuse me, 1916. That's when those shootings started. Before that, all of these confrontations, you can't even call them confrontations, these interfaces between terrestrial life and extraterrestrial life were always, from what I can tell, always of a benign nature. For the example of Pharaoh Thutmose III, over 3,000 years ago, there was no violence involved. These things just showed up. Everybody saw them. It terrified people. People were very frightened. But there was no effect. No one was hurt. And when these things left, they left behind a shaken populace in Egypt, but not anybody that was damaged. I should mention also that this period under Thutmose III was an extremely enlightened period in Egypt. You had very high levels of literacy. The society was very well organized. There was peace. Culture was rising very high. It was a golden age, really. It's one of Egypt's golden ages. It was an enlightened period for sure. And so you're not
Frank,
dealing with
these earlier accounts too, like back to that time before, let's say, 100 and some years ago. Nowadays you can always think a UFO is a military aircraft that we're testing or whatever, but nobody had any technology like that 100 years ago or before.
No, not at all. When these sightings were made in 1916 that I write about in the book, no one on Earth ever considered these objects, which were being seen, as extraterrestrial. No, it never occurred to anyone at all. No one ever said this is from another dimension, another planet. They were always described uniformly the same as enemy technology. World War I, it was Kaiser Bill's enemy aircraft of some kind. Although what's interesting is that those descriptions that were made in 1916 were extremely accurate. And these eyewitness reports were submitted by police officers, by military officers, and by citizens. And they described these things that they saw as Mexican hats, resembling Mexican sombreros. Well, what does that sound like? That's what we hear, the flat body and the dome on top. They're described as look like some kind of metallic flying hat that makes no noise whatsoever and travels at an incredibly high speed, and that obviously it's German engineers that are responsible for this. Of course, the Germans were seeing the same things as well, and they were ascribing it to British technology. Now, this is something that the English have come up. They're also describing as these flying hats, because that's what they looked like. They didn't look like airplanes. They didn't move like airplanes. No one ever thought that this is extraterrestrial. That came decades later. Really into our time. We're talking about the late 1940s before anybody started thinking about these things as being extraterrestrial. So that adds, I think, a level of credibility to what this is, because after the war it was found out that when they got their notes together that these were not German super machines or Allied super machines. They were something else.
Hey, Frank, wasn't the Battle of L.A. like 1942 or something?
The Battle of Los Angeles took place in early 1942, and it's called the Battle of Los Angeles in a sort of a mocking or a humorous fashion, because supposedly everybody was spooked after Pearl Harbor, which, by the way, had taken place almost 2 months before, so they had plenty of time to get over their trauma. And supposedly they were firing, the anti-aircraft of Los Angeles were flying at cloud formations all night long, and nobody saw anything for sure except they thought that maybe Japanese planes were there. And the Secretary of Defense laughed it off afterwards as just rattled nerves. If you look into the details of this, however, a completely different story emerges. The intruder aircraft were spotted by ground radar. They were spotted by civil defense workers. They were not described as airplanes whatsoever. The Army general in charge of Los Angeles, an overall command, whose name I don't recall because I have thousands of names in this book. I can't remember all of them. It's described in greater detail I can remember here. But he greatly opposed Secretary of War Stimson, who was in charge of the armed forces at that time, saying that no, that his forces, his ground forces, and the anti-aircraft had fired on actual objects. They had sighted them. They'd been seen. Aircraft had been scrambled. There was no interception, though, because these things took off far beyond the capabilities of any piston-driven aircraft. There were hundreds, literally hundreds of eyewitnesses on the ground. And if you look at those reports, and I've studied those reports, these are not the reports of hysterical people who are mistaking clouds for airplanes, for Japanese bombers. They're seeing a real thing. And what they're seeing doesn't resemble any airplane at all.
Yeah.
Say that again, Ron.
And I was just saying there's so many people. It's not like there were two people. There's a lot of corroborating people.
Hundreds.
Yeah.
Hundreds. And some of these people are still alive today. They swear on the Bible what they saw was actually it. There was this one gentleman who who passed away about 3 years ago. Anson was his name, A-N-S-O-N. And this man was a physics professor at, I think, University of California, Berkeley. Not the sort of a type that you would imagine as, off his nut and making up stories. And he says, too, he says, no way. He says, when they first saw this one object that was caught in the spotlights, the beacons over Los Angeles, they said they thought it was, first of all, a blimp or a dirigible. It looked like a dirigible of some kind, because it had this long cigar shape. But the trouble was it had no fins on it. It didn't make any noise. Between the blasts of the anti-aircraft going off, there was utter silence. There were periods of silence. It made no noise. It was flying very low, just a few hundred feet, and then it would speed up. And it says they were convinced it was an enemy Zeppelin of some kind. Of course, the Japanese never had anything like that. They never launched anything like that at the United States. They did have balloons. That came much later, though. That came towards the end of the war. And these were actually ingenious weapons. They were hot air. It's kind of like, not hot air balloons, but they were balloons that were timed to explode. And they did set some fires off in the Pacific Northwest. That was in 1945 and 1944. Battle of Los Angeles took place in 1942. The Japanese had nothing like that. They didn't need to do that. They were winning the war at that point, if you remember. Their fleet was running a rampage all over the Pacific. They didn't have to bother about attacking Los Angeles. That was the least thing on their minds. So the Battle of Los Angeles was a true battle in which at least one of these craft was brought down, and I bring that in the book as well. There was the Navy admiral, U.S. Navy admiral, who talks about how one of these craft was brought down and crashed into the sea, and they retrieved it. The American Armed Forces have been retrieving UFOs since March 1941. That one, at least, is very excellently documented. Not by me, but by this fellow who's written a superb book about the March 1941 crash that took place in Missouri. Then the other one that took place was at the Battle of Los Angeles, where the anti-aircraft did score some hits on one of these craft, which did crash into the sea not too far off the California coast, and they retrieved that. So it's not anything new. I mean, we talk about Roswell, that's really well known, but there were several incidents before that.
Now,
and the interesting thing is, I'm not writing about this as this is not my theory or opinion. Every statement that I make in the book is backed up by my bibliography and my sources. I don't make a single report that does not come from a military report.
Now, this book is mostly about military, and I'm curious. we talk a lot about the 20th century because that's when most of the true evidence that we have comes from the 20th and 21st century. But I mean, we've had many wars over millennials millenniums here on Earth, like the Civil War and the Revolutionary War. Did you go back far enough to where you even have accounts of sightings during these wars, or no?
Yes, that's a really great question. I was interested in seeing if there was any kind of intervention on the UFO's part with any other conflicts. And the UFO sightings that were made during the Civil War, so forth, as you say, and all the way back into ancient times, those sightings were really no different than sightings that were made in peacetime. In other words, these vehicles were seen. Sometimes the occupants were seen. Extraterrestrials themselves were observed. But there's no violence that I can find. There was no destruction or killing on either side until World War I. That is a line in the sand, so far as I'm able to tell. Maybe our listeners will be familiar with this to a greater extent than I am, but I was not able to find a single instance in which there was any loss of life or property before 1916. 1916 on, you bet, plenty. That's when.
What do you attribute that to?
Really changed. I attribute it. I think it's clear from the evidence why that took place. First of all, these beings have been observing us for thousands of years, and we're of some interest to them. I don't know why or to what extent, but in 1916, in World War I, humanity did two things for the very first time. We were able to invent high explosives. With the advent of World War I, the development of artillery and high explosives between 1914 and 1916 was dramatic. So high explosives were made. As a matter of fact, there was no concept of HE before 1914. So you had munitions industries like Krupp in Germany and the DuPont industries in the United States that were manufacturing high explosives. And the other thing was, for the very first time, we could take these high explosives into the air. We had the capacity, admittedly primitive. Bombers in those days were just cloth-covered wooden kites, that's all. But nonetheless, human beings had made the transition from strictly land-based, strictly terrestrial, to now we're in the air. It does not take much of an interpolation, especially for an advanced society that has the capacity to visit not only this world, but probably, almost certainly, numerous other places similar to ours, a technology which is able to transgress galaxies, that they saw our capacity now to bring high explosives into the air. It does not take much of an extrapolation from that all the way, bring it forward, where within 100 or 200 years, these same humans are going to be able to bring nuclear explosives into outer space. And that's exactly what historically took place. Between only 1916 and 1945, I mean, that's nothing.
Yeah.
In terms of historical development. We went from these primitive bombers to the B-29 that drops 2 atomic bombs without any compulsion. We had no hesitation in nuclear destruction of 2 civilian cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that had virtually no military value. Actually, from what I can tell, neither of those cities, especially Nagasaki, had any military value whatsoever. And yet, what does that say about our species that's willing to do such a thing? And then at the end of World War II, what else came to be invented? Not only the atomic bomb, but the ballistic missile, the German V2. Again, it doesn't take much of a brain to see that you're going to make very fast technological steps.
Right.
And now what do we have in this century? We have the United States Space Force. We finally admit we've got nuclear weapons capability in space. We've had nuclear capability in space for at least 10 years already, probably much longer than that. This is going to alarm an intelligent species that is not going to be too happy with our track record, not a track record for devastating our own species, going now into space, into their galactic neighborhood. And I think they saw that in 1916, and 1916 is when the violence started. It began on their side. They began destroying, with great precision, one munitions plant after another in the United States. They were almost all DuPont plants. And I document that in the book thanks to a British researcher who brought this up. I'd never heard of this before. This information is not well known in the United States. It is now. That the DuPont Industries, which had a terrific record for safety for well over 100 years, were seeing the violent destruction of their munitions plants, because by that time, 1916, the United States was the main arms supplier for the Allies. The French and the British had about exhausted themselves by 1916. The war was a mutual slaughter. The British were not winning. The French were not winning. Either were the Germans. It was completely stalemated. And in order to stay in the game, the British and the French came to the United States, especially DuPont, and they made all these loans and so forth, and the DuPont Industries began churning out high explosives.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what saved the Allies, because there were a lot of peace movements. But that's another thing. But these DuPont Industries that were being blown up, systematically destroyed, were accompanied, not in every instance, but in the majority of cases, by sightings of these flying Mexican hats, these metallic hats, which everybody thought were German aircraft. Of course, German aircraft in 1916, they had a capacity to fly from, Munich to Stuttgart. That's about as far as they could possibly go, and they could have a top speed of about 110 miles an hour, and the highest payload they could carry would be about maybe 110 pounds of bombs. They're not going to be over here bombing our DuPont plants, and they had certainly no Mexican flying hats that could achieve tremendous.
I never heard of this, Tony. Have you? You're saying that these UFOs blew this stuff up?
The UFOs blew it up.
Really?
And the witnesses involved were police authorities, military authorities. Yeah, the UFOs blew up these plants. Yes, they did. They destroyed them. They were after America's capability to keep this war going. If the DuPont Industries had not funded the British and the French, the war would have ended in 1917, 1916, before we even got into it. Because the DuPont Industries kept that war going.
Oh, yeah, they made a lot of money.
The equivalent of many trillions of dollars. But the Germans were really interested in an armistice, which they had proposed to the French and the British numerous times. The British and French said, no, we want to keep it going, but then they realized they couldn't keep it going in 1916. And if there had been an overture to the Germans, the Kaiser would have accepted immediately, because he didn't have the wherewithal either. But he wasn't as lucky as the French or the British, because he had no fat cat allies like the Americans. And that's how that war kept going.
Well, Frank, I want to go back, or actually kind of stay in that era of when the Red Baron had a dogfight with a UFO, and I've heard about it, but I don't know the specifics. Could you give us a little bit more rundown of that?
I was very reluctant to put that story in. I debated for a long time. I decided not to put it in originally. I did further research on it. I tried to verify it. And my European colleagues are pretty sure that it actually happened. They're more confident in it than I am. I decided to put it in anyway and let readers judge for themselves. I'm kind of on the fence if this really happened or not. There is real solid documentation for a lot of it, but not all of it.
Right.
The story is this. In early March 1917, what is known as the Red Baron, Baron Manfred von Richthofen, which was the leading ace in World War I, Germany's top ace, he was out on a morning patrol with a cadet. And this was typical of him, by the way. This is one of the things that made me think that this actually happened, because von Richthofen was kind of different than his fellow officers. It didn't make any difference how high-ranking he was, how famous he was. He would take out a brand-new cadet and show him the ropes. And so that story goes that he flew out over Flanders with this new cadet. His name was Weisrich. Cadet Weisrick, and the Red Baron showed him, this is where you go and this is what you do. And all of a sudden, in front of them appeared a large silvery disc. It was many times larger than the aircraft they were flying. And von Richthofen, he was by that time, of course, an instinctual killer. And so anything that flew in front of his sights, he fired on immediately if it didn't have an iron cross on it. And so he fired on this thing, and it went down. It crashed. Seems rather remarkable that a spindly little World War I aircraft with a 7.5mm machine gun would be able to shoot down a UFO, but nonetheless, supposedly this is what happened. Thing went down. It crashed. Both von Richthofen and Weisrick circled around the crash, which was, they described as kind of a slow crash. It didn't really spin into the ground or catch fire or anything like that. It just went down, although it looked like it was out of control. And they saw a rupture in this thing, and two little bald-headed guys, they say, ran out of it and disappeared into the forest. The report was filed by von Richthofen to his superiors, and the superiors told him, don't mention anything about this because this is obviously Allied super technology. We're going to go out and try to retrieve it. We don't know if it's ever been retrieved. About less than 3 weeks, I think about 3 weeks later, this is the interesting thing too, the United States finally did declare war on Imperial Germany, and it was at that time, really early on, that there was the first military confrontation, real military confrontation between the United States Army and a UFO. And that was 4 men guarding a naval base in Massachusetts were attacked by a flying vehicle which they fired on, and they drove it off. They again filed their reports, and they were told the same thing by their American superiors. Don't mention anything about this because this is German technology. And as far as von Richthofen shooting the UFO down, I tend to agree that it really did happen, although unfortunately I do not have the tight documentation that I have for every other thing that I have in the book. But I felt that it should be mentioned, and readers can check out my sources for it, and they can decide.
Well, I want to go down south a little bit because you talked about in your book, Military Encounters with Extraterrestrials, you talked about the reveal of the U.S. Navy defeat in the Antarctica by ETs. This has become like a very hot topic. I know, right. Captain Ron, you've been really interested in this, so I know you have some questions about this.
Yep.
So can you talk about the U.S. Navy defeat? Because I'm not for sure if I remember this one, and then I know that's going to open up some more questions about what's going on right now.
It's an incredible story. It is truly unbelievable, and if our listeners don't believe this, I can understand it. But if you read the book, hopefully it's more convincing. It's called Operation High Jump, and it took place. It began in December 1946, and it lasted all the way until February 1947. Operation High Jump was this. It was nothing less than a gigantic, powerful military task force. It was a military invasion of Antarctica. It was not a scientific expedition. Now, why on earth would the United States Navy want to invade Antarctica in 1946? In 1946, the world was at peace. And the reason the world was at peace was because the world was wrecked. World War II had destroyed almost every nation on Earth with the exception of the United States. Operation High Jump, this immense task force, which involved a fleet of destroyers, a submarine, a gigantic aircraft carrier, state-of-the-art communications vessels, hundreds of pilots, thousands of Navy personnel, all headed towards the Antarctic, led by Admiral Richard E. Byrd, the most famous polar explorer probably of all time. And he's the guy they put in charge of this. They go down, supposedly, when it was being when this task force was being readied and taking off, it got a lot of news media play. And you can go to YouTube and punch in all this stuff. Just punch in Operation High Jump, send off in New York, and you'll see the newsreels released that time. And Richard E. Byrd was asked, as a good regular question by one of the news reporters, well, what is the purpose of Operation High Jump? And Admiral Byrd fired back right away. He says, it's a military operation. And then his vice admiral in charge butted in, cut him off, said, well, not really. It's a scientific expedition. And that was the end of that interview. So they go down there in 1947. They were supposed to be there for 8 months. That was the announced program. They were going down there and do all kinds of testing. Testing with an aircraft carrier and a submarine and place. And they had also squadrons of the Grumman Mariner. The Grumman Mariner was this extremely powerful flying boat loaded to the teeth with bombs, torpedoes, cannons. You know, it doesn't exactly sound like a scientific instrument. So they go down there for 8 months, supposedly. Within about 2 months, they cancel, and they come back. The fleet, this task force, limps into Chile, Valparaiso, Chile. For repairs, men are being carried off that are brought to Chilean hospitals because hospital supplies and facilities on board the task force are insufficient. And Admiral Byrd is interviewed by El Mercurio. El Mercurio is the largest, still in existence, the largest Spanish-speaking periodical or newspaper in the world, the Spanish-speaking world. It was then and it is now. And Admiral Byrd almost lets the cat out of the bag in this interview. He's a very honest, straight-shooting guy. And you can tell in the interview he has a very hard time telling exactly what he wants to say, but he does say some remarkable things. He says that, first of all, he says, I have to alert all of El Mercurio's readers that we are in a very perilous situation today. He says, I mean, we, all the people of Earth, there are now, and he says this in the interview, and he says there are enemy vehicles which are able to travel from pole to pole in a matter of moments. Well, let me tell you, that would not have included the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union in 1946 was one vast ruin. They were a threat to nobody. I mean, their infrastructure barely survived World War II, so they were. There's no way they could be a threat to anybody. And he goes on saying that, yes, this is very. I don't mean to alarm anyone, but we have to gear up for this. Put this in the context of the times. February 1947? I mean, it makes no sense. And then when Admiral Byrd got back to the United States, he got canned.
Wow.
That was the end. He made his report, and that was the end of his career. He was in retirement after that. They couldn't do anything to him because he was so famous, like they did to some other people, like his friend Admiral Forrestal, who they threw out of a hospital window. That's another story altogether. But Operation High Jump was involved in a shootout, a real firefight. And it wasn't with German flying saucers. I looked into that. That was one of the stories. Oh, the Germans had a secret base down there. The Germans didn't have a secret base down in there. The Germans never even went to Antarctica, except in 1937. They sent one ship down there on a true scientific expedition. That was not a military thing. It was one ship. That was called the Schwabenland. That was in 1939. It's an extremely involved, convoluted story because even that German expedition that went down there in 1939, it was kind of a propaganda thing for the Third Reich. Oh, look what great scientists we are, and we're doing all this polar exploration. And they did do some exploration, and they found more than they bargained for. And one of their people that they were really in tight with was Admiral Richard E. Byrd. In 1939, just before World War II, Admiral Richard E. Byrd went to Germany, Nazi military. He was a paid agent for the NKVD, the Soviet Union. They came out long after the man died. He should have been hung as a traitor, and there were a lot like that. And the Soviets had this great documentation on Operation High Jump. Stalin and his closest advisors knew more about Operation High Jump than the American public did. And it wasn't until after the Soviet Union collapsed, after it fell, that this information finally came out. It was published in all the post-Soviet papers, and so it's really well known in Russia, but not well discussed here. So I had to go back to some of those sources and find out. And they quote original transcripts and so on. But what happened was the United States Navy had an actual military confrontation with UFOs who had, and probably still have, a base down there. And the Americans suffered very badly, and they were forced into retreat.
But, Frank, do you think that's what's going on now? Because this has been in the news for the last few years with the ice melting down there. They claim to have found items under the ice and whatnot. You think that's an extraterrestrial base down there?
It very well could be. I wouldn't be surprised. I can't document any of those, but I'm not surprised. I'm not even really that interested in it. I mean, it's great that it's coming out and all that, but it really comes as no surprise. I think that there's been a base down there for, who knows, could be for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years perhaps, who knows. But there certainly was one down there in 1947 when the U.S. Navy got whooped and had to retreat to Chile in order to take care of its men who were suffering all kinds of burns and things. You know, men were seen being taken off on stretchers. I mean, this is nothing. The Chileans themselves saw a number of sailors being taken off. I mean, what could possibly have happened? But what did happen, of course, was this firefight that took place. The Americans lost, as said, several aircraft. They lost at least one destroyer called the USS Maddox. She sank. And but the UFOs, they didn't lose anything there. But they did lose one. This how strange this story is. Like I said, our listeners, I think this is so nuts. One UFO was shot down, and it was a big cigar-shaped deal, and it was shot down almost by accident. It was shot down by a submarine, a submarine called the USS Senate, and it was a commander whose name was Eisenhower, but not the same Eisenhower that became president. His name is spelled differently. The submarine USS Senate was on normal patrol, scouting on the edge of the task force, when this thing came over, flying very slow and low, and Commander Eisenhower ordered all of his weaponry, his deck gun and his anti-aircraft, to open fire on the thing, and they scored direct hits on it, and it crashed. I don't know if it was retrieved. I don't know if they investigated. I have no documentations on that whatsoever. But the deck gun, which was pretty good size, it was a 5-inch gun. That was the same gun that they mounted on destroyers, scored a direct hit on this thing, and it crashed. That was the only one. They tried to knock down the others, but didn't succeed.
So, Frank, why do you think you said all these years and thousands of years they've kind of just observed us? Why do you think? Yeah. Why do you think this particular one that they actually engaged in military action against us when they haven't before, or at least we don't know of before?
Oh, they had plenty of times before. That was not the first engagement. That was just the first really big one, I guess, the big one that I know about. No, they destroyed both Allied and Axis planes during World War II. They didn't have any preference there. They shot down, they destroyed a Japanese Zero that was dispatched out of Hokkaido to intercept 2 of these flying discs. The Japanese opened fire on it immediately. The UFOs returned fire and destroyed that Zero and killed the man inside. And then in 1944, and that was a year before, in 1944, a B-17 was set on fire in a attempted raid over France, and it fell out of the sky like a flaming comet. So there were deaths and destruction on both sides before Operation High Jump. But it's only from 1916 that these encounters really began,
right,
where shooting started.
And because most countries, I mean, we today, if a country, shoots down one of our planes, it puts us in pretty much a military action, and we go in and, I mean, look at Libya and other countries. We went in and destroyed, airfields and stuff like that. You would think with the technology that UFOs have, I mean, they could go in and just pretty much wipe out our military, like you said, back then. You would think they would just continue to say, if you're going to be aggressive towards us, we're just going to go in and take out anything that they can do to hurt our people. So why do you think they just kind of barely wound us and then send us home and stop there?
These are all excellent points that you bring up, but we have to understand that we're not dealing with the human intelligence.
Right. Yeah.
No way we can understand how they think. Maybe they are humans from the future. That's one of the things. I have no idea where they come from, but probably they are not human. It's like us trying to figure out, well, what does a gorilla really think? And gorillas are really close to us, but we can't figure out what they think. Now, how can we possibly understand this? Sometimes they kind of wound us, like say. Other times it's been pretty vicious, especially in the Soviet Union. There was a terrific air battle in which at least a dozen or so Soviets were killed all at once in one instance. So why they are behaving this way, I don't know.
Right.
My task that I gave myself in writing this book is just to report what has happened and not to speculate too much.
Right.
I try to have as little trying to second-guess these things. But my only real answer to that is we don't know how these creatures think. It's possible, too, that an interpretation, if you want, and I don't really speculate about this in the book too much, is that they just want to warn us. Don't do this stuff.
Right.
There was an incident fairly recently, in other words, just about, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, in which one of Elon Musk's satellites, which was getting ready to be launched into space for the military, was destroyed by a UFO, and that's very extremely well documented. Photographic evidence has been gone over 1,000 times, and they just are letting us know, don't do this stuff. If you want to destroy yourself, you want to blow up your world and have more Hiroshimas and Nagasaki's, that's fine. That's all, but keep it on Earth. Don't bring that stuff into space.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, our time is up, man. This is always such a great joy, and we've learned so much from you. Everybody go out and get the book, Military Encounters with Extraterrestrials, The Real World of the Wars, or War of the Worlds, got it backwards, my dyslexia there. And again, this is pretty interesting stuff that we love to find out about, and it's always a pleasure to have you on the show.
Well, the pleasure is mine, and I just wish I'd been able to hear what Captain Ron had to say about Operation High Jump. I still have a lot to learn on all this stuff, and we'll have to have an interview with you on that sometime.
There you go.
We'll do it again. Yeah, sounds good. There's a lot of new stuff right now about it. Yep.
Oh, really? Oh, boy, I have to keep my eye out on that. It was just a fantastic encounter.
So, Frank, where do people find you and find your books and all that good stuff?
Well, the best place, I guess, to get Military Encounters with Extraterrestrials at Amazon.com. It's the cheapest place and the easiest way to get it. It's in a number of bookstores. If people still go to bookstores, you can find it in Barnes & Noble. And as far as getting in contact with me, I'm at ancientamericans.com. I'm turning into an ancient American myself. You see. I can understand Alzheimer's American. No, it's Ancient American.
Google.com.
And there's a website there that has ways to get in contact with me, and I try to answer all the emails that come my way.
All right. Well, thank you, Frank, so much for being on Truth Be Told. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's a pleasure discussing this scary stuff.
Oh, yeah. No, it's not scary for us. This is good stuff. So, all right, take care of yourself. All right, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to Truth Be Told right here on go to our YouTube channel, Truth Be Told Radio.
Boy, none of you guys could spit it out where you're from.
I know, it's like ba-da. And then go to iTunes and iHeartRadio, Spotify, all those places. You could check out all our podcasts and our videos. But until next time, I'm Tony Sweet. Who are you, Captain Ron?
I would be Captain Ron.
That's it. All right, take care.
Yeah.